Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. As you know, we are currently overcoming massive censorship. If you want to support this show, please do what you can to share the episodes far and wide. Join the email list or the community because they've also deleted Patreon and episodes. So if you want to make sure you get every episode, go to mattbelair.com and sign up for the membership. But most importantly, consider doing three kind acts wherever you are in the world today. Today's guest is a sociologist, researcher, and writer. He previously worked in the Sociology Department at Lancaster University. He is the author of over 15 books, including his newest, Unified: Cosmos, Life, Purpose, Communicating with the Unified Source Field, and How This Can Guide Our Lives. Welcome to the show, Kingsley Dennis.
Hello, Matt. Great to be here. First time speaking with you, so I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. My friend, I've heard your name in the ether before, and then my friend is like, "Hey, have you seen this book?" She read the book and she loved it. I started to look at what you've done and all the books you've written. Pretty much every one I want to read and dive into, and so I'm just excited to have you on the show and go into a variety of different topics. But why don't you give the audience who's unfamiliar with your work a little bit about your background and what you do today?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and give it in a nutshell. I suppose the first 15 years or so of my life was spent traveling after university, that is. And like many people, there were questions of what is life, what is the purpose, what do I want from life, because I didn't have a career in mind. So I went traveling. And then to support my traveling, I went into teaching. And then I trained to be an educator and a teacher. And then really I was working in first in Europe, in Central Europe, in Czech Republic. I spent 5 years or so in Istanbul, in Turkey. I traveled around the Middle East and different areas. And then I came to a point whereby, wow, the world really is changing. So I thought, well, why don't I go back into study and study sociology so I could better figure out the world? And so I did so. I went back to the UK. I was, I suppose, in my early 30s by that time. And then I did a doctorate in sociology. But the question always on my mind was not so much the physical structures, but how people's thinking patterns, how human consciousness affects our lives. Because I've been seeing, I've been living in different cultures, experiencing different perspectives. And the world was changing so much, especially at that time, we were in the middle of like what they call globalization. But I was interested in technologies as well, how technologies brought people together. So I went back, I did my, let's say, groundwork. I worked in sociology, I lectured in sociology, and I did my doctorate in complex systems and how complex systems using technologies can bring people together in non-linear ways. But then the central question was, these are the physical structures. This is the hardware. How does the software affect us and our connections? And I was getting more and more interested in human consciousness, but of course, university and that kind of academia couldn't really incorporate where I wanted to go. So eventually I jumped ship. I decided to leave my career at university, even though it was going on a good curve. I decided to leave. And literally, I left England with one bag of clothes and one laptop computer. And I took myself to Andalusia, southern Spain. I found myself a wonderful part of the world there, a nice corner of Andalusia. I sat down, and for the last 12 years, I was writing books, trying to figure out what's going on in the world and how can we kind of understand it. And that brought me to where I am now. So that is, I guess, in a nutshell, my life so far.
Well, I love it, and we share the similar passion of trying to understand consciousness. Consciousness, life purpose, the meaning of life, and how our consciousness can shape and influence our reality. And from your research, I'd love to get into the book because you talk about energy, vibration, the cosmos, other civilizations, all things that I'm very curious about. So I wonder if there's somewhere that you feel like we should start, or my thought has always been like, how do we live a peaceful life, but also an empowered one? Like, what does it mean to live a good life? And how can I use my consciousness to architect or create my reality deliberately? Like, one distinction I see in people is one set will kind of create the reality by default. Whatever happens to them, they think that it's materialistic, and they just kind of, go
Mhm.
along with the circumstances they have. And the other ones are like, okay, what's most important to me? What are my values? What do I want to create here? How can I give back? And then how can I use my consciousness to begin to create this reality, but do it from a state of peace? And I feel like that's a little bit more of a higher aim. And I'm just curious how you'd see those things and how you'd weave that in with your model of the world.
Well, what you talked about is perfectly right. These are higher aims. Um, how I arrived there was really going back to basics, because I realized that there was so much conversation and chatter going on in the world, especially when the communications open up all the connections. But then I began to realize that the question was, are we using the same references? When I talk about reality, is the person I'm speaking to has the same concept of reality? Because if not, then we're not kind of on the same playing field. And so what I realized, and I guess this also came through my kind of background in sociology, is that we grow up in the midst of a huge amount of social conditioning. And so depending on where you are born and grew up in your definitive years, culturally, socially, with your family background, your friends, depending on your education, all these terms get a different kind of framing. So if you want to talk about consciousness, reality, what is life, first we have to kind of go back and think, well, what do I mean by that? And so if I say consciousness, am I on the same page as you on consciousness? Because we could be speaking, but on completely different levels, and just like passing each other by, like two friends on two different trains. They wave at each other, but they're not really talking. So, so in order to arrive here, I had to kind of do like 2 decades of kind of deconditioning, and for example, when I came to publish my first monograph, it came out in 2012. People would ask me, how long did it take you to write it? And the truth is, it took me about 5 months to write it, because it just fell out of me. But the greater truth was, it took me 20 years to write it, because I couldn't write it until I deconditioned my old programming. So, and I think what's happening, what I'm witnessing now is that people are actually going through their own deprogramming, but much quicker. It's happening greater acceleration in the world. So now it's much easier for us to have these conversations. Like, I don't really know your background too well, but I get the sense, I get the energy when I'm looking at you now, that if we talk about consciousness, we're going to have a similar understanding. But that wasn't the case 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, you bring up a lot of great points, and the one is just being on the same page, right? Because even when you, like, I was having a discussion in one of the coaching groups that I'll run, and say, like, how information and our spirituality and our knowing grows. So you could take a spiritual verse, right, from the Bible or the Vedas or wherever, and read it, but then the next day you yourself may have a different idea of that, or the next month, or the next year. So everybody has their own perception of reality. So when we're talking about consciousness or these deeper subjects, to see if you're even aligned, if the words mean the same thing. And I also hosted a law summit where they really decode the words, and you look up the definition, you think you know what it means, and then you're looking it up and you're realizing, whoa, this isn't, this is way more information by looking at what it actually means and all the different variations, or you realize you were way off. And so you might not be using the same words or have the same meaning. So I think that that's important. When you talk about, communicating with the unified field source, is it your understanding that, because you also talk about, life purpose and aligning with this, what's your thoughts on just knowing what the truth is, and having like a spiritual connection? Because for me, I've been thinking about that lately. I went to the
Mhm.
Parliament of World Religions. I wanted to know God or the creator. And then someone's telling me, well, God is a messed up word, that you should actually use creator. And all the Native Americans used to say that. And my thought is, I want to have a connection with the creator, the universe, the source, what is right, what is good, what is
Mhm.
true. So how do you frame that in your world, and how could we move toward that navigation of being connected to the actual truth and being guided by a benevolent force that is leading us in a positive direction, not get misled or deceived?
Well, you certainly start with a $6 million question, Matt. Right. So let's jump in there. A lot to kind of unravel. Well, I mean, my perspective is that, I mean, all life is fundamentally spiritual. and because it cannot not be. You know, we, the old kind of thinking that life, was just an accident that sprang out of these, chemical soup, and then, like, life on planet Earth is just a pure accident, and Earth is a dead rock, you know, spiraling or flying through a dead universe. Well, that is just so Mickey Mouse. How can we even conceive that? Because obviously there's so much against that, and the more that we get to listen to ourselves, we get to an inner knowing. So yes, life is inherently spiritual, but of course, until we can realize that, we often use structures like words. We talk about religion, we talk about God. It's like a scaffolding, before you can complete a building construction, you put these scaffolding on the outside to hold it in place. Um, and then when you get there, you can take all the support away. For me, language is like a support. Is that we need it when we're trying to reach a point of understanding. When you get there, it doesn't matter if you call it God or creator or source. We have an innate understanding of what that is, and I do feel that all living sentient beings have that innate connection. It's just being covered up. I used to refer to it as like the bridge to the real. And you have to polish it all the time. You have to keep polishing it to make it real to you, to make it tangible, because otherwise, we may miss it, or even though it's there. So I've tended to use the word source in more recent times, because we can call it origin, because I don't want to I don't want to start getting to an argument of, do I use religious words that other people have a different religion with. um, I think it was the poet Rumi who said, there are many ways to walk up a mountain, but the view at the top is the same. And there's many ways to paraphrase that. So instead of talking about, the eastern path, or the western path, or the northern path up the Eiger, or let's go up this way up Everest, let's talk about, the view at the top. Um, so, so yes, the question is, how do we break through those filters, those barriers that we get too attached to language, we get too attached to, let's say, cultural baggage or religious nominations, but at the heart of it, we're all speaking about the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just taking some notes as you're chatting there. A lot came to my mind. One of them was like there's infinite paths to the way home, and one of the things that I've kind of deduced is like your will to get there, because that's the only thing that, well, there's other things, but your intent is one of the only things you can know within yourself. So if the person is has the will and desire to know the creator, to know the truth, to know source, to connect with life, beauty, and all the good things, that's going to steer them, right? If they're
Mhm.
not putting any will or intention there, then you can kind of be pulled and tugged in different directions and kind of go off track. So I feel like if you have that intention, whatever path for you is going to be unique to you. Everybody is going to have a totally unique path, because like you talked about with the conditioning, you growing up in the UK and me in Canada, even an individual who is my friend and came up in the same schools is going to have a totally different life experience because of their parents and their influences and maybe what they watched on TV and their brothers and sisters. So there are all these other conditions that apply. So each of us is going to have a very unique path back to creation, or whatever we want to call that, source or unified field. But I feel like one of the important concepts you touched on is going beyond this idea that it's materialistic. I just had Mark Gober on, and he's written a couple great books, and he talked about how he was a Princeton,
Mhm.
really smart guy, graduated with honors and all that kind of stuff. And he thought his view was very materialistic. And so for him, it was meaningless. So when he was suffering in his mind, he's like, oh, well, this is just the way it is. Nothing really matters. It's all just material. And he's like, I actually believe that. And so I thought I should just suck it up. I should just
Mhm.
go through it. And there's no spiritual connection. And what you just said at the beginning, I think is so important, is that fundamental belief that all life is fundamentally spiritual. Because if it's material, I think it leads to a lot more suffering. Nothing is special, nothing is unique, nothing is
Mhm.
meaningful, right? And those are important things to touch on. So if you want to comment on that, go for it. But one of the technical questions I'd love to ask you is, how do we let go of our conditioning? How do we, we have all these conditions and all of these influences. How do we kind of reverse the slate to check, what's true and not, and start to create from who we actually are?
Yeah. Well, you said a lot of things there. And in your previous question, you talked about unified source field. And I didn't want to talk about that straight away. I wanted to kind of build up to it and talk about consciousness before we get to unified source field. So, but I would like to come back on that idea that you talked about intent, because I think intention is crucial. Because, when we get past the material paradigm, we realize that we're living in a participatory reality, a participatory cosmos, if you like. And so we are in continual kind of interaction, because when we realize that behind materiality is energies and vibration, then they work on, energetics, and therefore they're always kind of interweaving. And so we're not these separate objects. We are kind of always blending and mixing into our emotions, our thoughts. It's only our physical body which seems separate. Our thoughts, our emotions are out there in the field, which we'll come to in a minute. So intention, and I don't mean kind of pseudo spiritual intention where, we were told to wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror and go, rah, you're a lion, I mean, it probably worked for those people with a hangover, but it's not going to cure your sense of purpose in life. So, but if you realize in deep seriousness that if we intend, we focalize. The same thing of like if you have a lamp, the light from the lamp, it helps you to read, helps you to see, but it's dispersed, it's not going to burn you. But if you sit next to a laser will burn you, because the laser is focused light, and that has much more power. And I think the same as with intent. If we're not conscious of our intention, and our thoughts kind of swim around, and they come in and they go out, we get influenced by memes, by propaganda, by news. We're not really focusing our thoughts, and that's just a dispersion of thinking, of being, and therefore that's why conditioning gets more of a hold. If we can actually be consciously aware of what we're thinking, or what's coming through our thoughts, and what we're speaking, and how we're interacting, we can narrow that into a more powerful kind of, let's say, energy of interaction. Like the light goes to a laser, and it has much more influence and effect in the reality around us. So that's going to go back to your earlier question. Conditioning. So shall I continue or speak about conditioning?
Oh yeah, I love it. Continue. I'm just taking a whole bunch of notes as you go
Right.
along, so that's why I'll mute myself because the typing comes through. Right. You can hear it on the podcast. So yeah, I'm just taking great notes. Well, I just
don't want to hog the conversation.
Oh no, keep going, man. I'll jump in when necessary. I love it. One of the things that you brought up, for me, I was reminded of this idea that I had once where, when I went through Dr. Joe Dispenza's work and did his advanced program, it just talked about how we have 70 to 90,000 thoughts a day. Right. Mm-hmm. And so if you were to print those thoughts and you were able to read them, you would see how many are habitual, which is most of them. And you would see if they were empowering, if they were connected. So your focus is always, it can be very broad. And, I have a background in sports performance and how do we, create a reality. So if you want to do, a trick, or even if you want to shoot a basketball shot in, or you want to do a very difficult trick in skateboarding, snowboarding, or gymnastics or something like that, all of your intent needs to be focused. And so that power harness is one of the things that I've been trying to communicate with people for a long time from the martial arts background, or when I train with the Shaolin monks. They break stone, all of their intent was right there. But when we navigate our days, it's very dispersed. And you're bringing this back to energy, which I think is really important. So that's kind of what I was taking notes on. So yeah, I'd love for you to continue.
Sure, thanks. And it all ties in, because obviously everything of existence is just different parts of the whole phenomenon. So let's talk about conditioning. So it's all about intention as well, because the great power within the human being is having the conscious ability to focus and to create and to move forward, to evolve through those creations. But of course, if we're dispersed, then we get more influenced by external events. And conditioning, generally social cultural conditioning, is a form to socially manage people. It's a kind of way of kind of bureaucracy, to be honest. It's a way to manage people because they want you to be part of an agreed consensus. Okay. And reality really is a consensus reality. Um, and before recent times, everyone adhered to the consensus reality because we didn't have any alternatives. Way back, let's say from the Middle Ages onwards, only the priestly castes and the monks, were reading the Bible and religious texts, and they would tell the people, what to think. It was only with like the printing press and the Gutenberg printing press that people could actually print the Bibles and start to learn to read themselves. And so gradually and then education came in to tell people, no, this is how you should think. If you want to go out to the school / workhouse, more or less same thing, you had to adhere to a way of thinking. And so society wants to gain consensus thinking, which in the end becomes nationalism. Because without nationalism, how can a nation defend itself? How can it persuade people to go to war if people aren't conditioned into a national mindset? So conditioning is a way for nations to gain and sustain their power. So it's a way of like telling you what to think. And also within the conditioning, there's great dispersion, is that the human mind is distracted. You're being told one thing and then you're distracted by entertainment or social pursuits. And so both sides, whether it's conditioning of political social conditioning, and then it's distraction through social activities or entertainment, both these things are keeping control of the external impacts. And we lose sight of the internal being, the internal side, because that takes a different type of focus. So really, to let go of conditioning, the first step is just awareness. Because unless you see the prison bars, you don't believe you're in a prison. You've got to know where you are. You've got to realize what state you're in before you can start to work on it. And it's only with, I think, the rise of information and alternative information outside of the consensus narrative, outside of the social cultural propaganda, people are now realizing that there's other things outside of their reality box. And by pursuing that, you can break your conditioning down. Just before I finish, one example I remember as a 20-year-old, I was reading the works of Robert Anton Wilson, who you may be familiar with. He was a California kind of writer. And he would say, 20 years ago, he would say, whatever newspaper or periodical or journal you like to read, go and buy the contrary one. If you read a democratic paper, go and buy a communist one. Go and buy something contrary to your belief system and read that, because you've got to start breaking out of your reality box. And I think that's the first stage of breaking it down, because to rebuild, you've got to reassemble.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great idea. And one of the things too, when you look into neuro-linguistic programming and how our mind works, they'll call it like a pattern interrupt. So a lot of the time, we just want the same thing that's going to fit that reality, that box that we already know. And just by viewing it, it doesn't mean you have to accept it. It means you're bringing in new ideas. And if you're just starting with this journey, I remember when I was a teenager, I was like, oh my goodness, I have to unlearn everything that I was taught. And it would just hit me, and I was like, okay. And then you start building yourself up from the ground up, and then just questioning everything. Why
Mhm.
do I believe this? Does this serve me? Is this true? Why do I believe it's true? Does this come from myself, my culture, my family, my country? What's actually going on here? And then start to take stock, because as children, we're in this Prussian school system where we're basically, taught not to really ask
Mhm.
questions, right? To just obey, to accept it, to memorize and go forward. And this is very strong conditioning for us. So even having the ability to reflect, and I like what you talked about of the distractions, right? Everything is preventing you from going to the inner world. And another step to that is your emotions, or what I think you'd put as your energetic state. Are you constantly in fear? Are you in stress? Are you in acceptance? Where are you on the emotional scale? And if you don't take a
Mhm.
little bit of time to reflect, you're not going to be able to improve the situation, or even reflect upon the situation to know if changes are necessary. Because I feel like often people can get into this cycle where they wake up, right? They grab their coffee, they run out the door, they think some certain thoughts on the way to work, they go through their work pattern, they get home, they got to do those things, and then they just go to bed. And that cycle can last for years and years. There's no space to reflect. And I feel like just
Mhm.
having that space, understanding these external influences, but to take the time to at least take the lens and go back within your mind, within your body, within your emotions, to just take an analysis. And then from there, reflect and move forward and make changes if necessary.
Yes, we definitely have to step back now because we're in such a heightened stimulation stage. I mean, I think humanity has never been in this state before of increased aggravation. And I think we're becoming more aware of it now because it's so in our faces. But, you know, human beings are now living in an increased electromagnetic environment. And that was discussed even like 20 years ago. There was the book Body Electric, I forget the writer, but was talking about we're living in an environment like millions of times heightened electromagnetically because of all the mass and the antennae. Well, that's been increased dramatically now because of obviously Wi-Fi and 4G, then 5G, all the satellites. We're living in increased stimulation. And so that's affecting us. And many people are feeling that through sensitivity because there are a certain percentage of the populace which have a heightened sensitivity and they get, really uncomfortable from this electromagnetic environment. But also the mind, because you mentioned NLP. I remember when I was researching NLP for a book before, I was talking to a marketeer, and they said, yeah, but do you realize that, not only do we use NLP, but we use neuromarketing techniques, where we know exactly, what items to place in the image for how many pixels, for how many, nano or millisecond, how to direct it. So marketing now is not just about putting an image on a screen or something. It's the art of science of getting into your neurons of your brain. That's why they call it neuromarketing. And it's only also recently in the last, let's say, 15 or so years that we have been aware of neuroplasticity, of how our pathways in our mind can be rewired. So if we're being bombarded with certain types of stimuli, then the brain, to cope with that, starts to rewire itself because the human body, being a wonderful, wonderful mechanism, is always recalibrating to be in line or more in alignment with its environment. Okay, so if you're born, especially today in today's world, if you're born into a almost fully technologized environment, you're using smartphones or tablets from an early age. Toddlers are sitting, in their potty with a smartphone these days. And then there's this environment that we're in and all the impacts. Then I think, there has to be, there has to be an awareness of this, and there has to be a response to really cultivate the inner state and the inner being. If not, I think we're going to be influenced and overstimulated to a point where the human body has never been pushed to that state. So it's crucial, Matt. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things that's going on now is the information overload, right? That's why people are in overwhelm because never have we been able to access such a great deal of information. And even that's an external process, right? When you're doing research and you have all of your smart devices and all of this thing going on, it's still external, right? And you're not
Mhm.
really taking that. We're not taught, or we don't value as much as a culture to go within, to have your own feeling and understanding, whether it's a meditative practice, a journaling practice, a writing practice, or even something like it's a creation practice like art or music or things like that. I think the Stoics would call it, um, was it a live time, right? So there's kind of like passive or dead time where you'd be zoning out, right?
Mhm.
Research, I think, would still be a live time, but it's still kind of a little bit passive in a way. You want to be learning, but you need to balance that with your output. Just like when, Bruce Lee would say, knowing is not enough. We must do. And so we have all this information, but how are we acting on it? In a way,
Mhm.
like from a sports background, we could know everything there is about the perfect weight training and the exercises that we could do down to a T and what to write, but we have to put that into practice. That is equally, if not more valuable than more the passive or the external or all of this information coming in. And so it can be very challenging for us to deal with, and we need to honor the integration side as much, the silence, the reflection as much as
Mhm.
the external and all those things coming in. When you in your book you talk about a unified reality, can you talk about what you mean by that and the importance of that? I have an idea of what I think it means, but I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Mhm. Sure. And by the way, I think you're totally spot on when you say we have to integrate with the life around us and be involved, because human beings and life, we are receivers, we're transmitters, we are part of the whole integration. So if we block that, then we are blocking our capacity to interact with material life. And material life isn't necessarily, it isn't anything bad. It's just a state of energy. Like when you boil water, it goes into steam. Steam isn't necessarily bad or negative, it's just a different state than water. And so materiality is a different state than the energetic background. And this is the unified reality, is that the unified reality is just existent in different states. So, and modern quantum physics has realized for a time that the ultimate kind of state is a state of energy. The question they're debating is whether energy is intelligent, whether it's a conscious energy or not, but they agree that it's an energetic state. And so they even use the terms matrix now. They say that the energetic state is beyond what we understand as the cosmos. It's beyond, um, even when we talk about, dark matter and the quantum state, that's kind of within our conception, but really the source energy is beyond our conception. But what we understand is what comes forth from that. So it's a kind of uh, it's almost a kind of still state. And then there are kind of manifestations, or you could say explosions of materiality. Energy comes out into form. And the universe or the cosmos is an energy state which is manifested from source. So, I mean, we could say, of course, we know it's a very well used analogy that, the wave comes from the ocean. The ocean is the background energy, and the wave is a manifestation of that. All cosmoses, and there's multiple cosmos and multiple multidimensional realities. I'm not just saying that. Latest science has now understood that we live in, there are multiple realities and multiple universes. So universes are kind of an energy wave coming out from source. And then as that goes along, it congeals or condenses into denser matter, which could be, solar systems, nebulae. And of course, it goes into, increased uh, states of densification, which could be a planet. So these are all manifestations of energy in different states. This is understandable, I think, with most people, because they understand from, basic science that we are made of atoms made of quarks. Beyond quarks, it's very difficult to know because there are different energy fluctuations. So everything's unified. And just because we're living in a material reality, and our senses, our major senses, should I say, the five senses we've been trained to use, they are aligned with materiality. Again, any optician will tell you that the human eye picks up a very, very, very thin slither of the electromagnetic spectrum and then beyond that is like 99.5% more of the electromagnetic spectrum. So our senses are geared to a slither of life, and materiality is a part of that. But what I'm saying is that the unified essence or field is trying to understand and accept and kind of appreciate that we are living within in a much grander conception. I can go further, but I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, I love all that. Well, I love seeing that spectrum. You can actually look it up, right, in what the eye will perceive and what's actually there as far as the light spectrum. It is so minuscule, and it's the same for the sound spectrum. It's so
Mhm.
minuscule. So I think it was Mark on the last podcast, or someone was just talking about how, consciousness actually limits everything. It limits our perception of actually what reality is. We're only getting a little tiny bit of it. And this is where yogis or spiritual masters or certain people will talk about this expanded reality. Sometimes you achieve it through meditation. And I've been fortunate enough to experience whatever that is directly. And it's beyond words. There's no way
Mhm,
that you can frame it in a word because it's so expansive. Alan Watts will talk about how it's a knife trying to cut itself. It's just
mhm.
impossible. It's such an interesting thing. Maybe when you're talking about the ocean, and I love the Rumi quote where he says, "You're not a drop in the ocean. You're the entire ocean itself." And that's what it is. It's going from this, maybe my consciousness is just the drop, right? And this is
Mm.
me trying to experience the entire ocean from this drop. But every now and then you can dip back in and experience the whole ocean in which you were a part of, which is a very beautiful thing, and maybe an analogy to how you see the unified field or cosmos. If you want to expand on what you're chatting about, please do. And the thing where I'd want to kind of direct it is, how do we move that toward our purpose? How do we
Mhm.
know what our life purpose is? And how do we communicate with this field so that we are in harmony or cooperation with it?
Yeah, sure. And I totally agree what you're saying about this understanding of the we are the ocean is an experiential thing. I mean, we're having a discussion now using language because we have a certain experiences and we know that what we're saying conveys something. But I would always say to anybody listening or anybody I talk to, you have to go away and try to find your own space because I'm talking about something, but it's only a very small fraction of what a person can feel for themselves. So ultimately, what is unification and purpose has to come down to a personal experiential state. But let's get to that. Let's get to the question of to get to the unified field and purpose. I want to talk about consciousness because I want to share with to you, Matt, my understanding of consciousness is that it's not something that we produce. Because if consciousness was something we produced, then why is it that there are so many experiences of people having communication out of body or after death, where the consciousness continues? You know, if the brain produced consciousness, just like the computer, I call it the computer model. Um, the computer creates, let's say, the program. If you turn the computer off, if the brain dies, there's no consciousness. But that's not true. So I would say I would put forward the idea that the human brain doesn't produce consciousness any more than a television produces its programs. Now, if someone came to your house and watched switched on the television and said, "Wow, your television produces all these different programs by itself," you'd think, I don't think that person has a quite good grasp on broadcasting. So I think what it is that consciousness is inherent in the unified field, in all existence, both in the energetics, behind materiality, and within materiality itself. What it is, of course, is that we can, all sentient beings can receive consciousness because it's all around us in the field, and then we filter it through our own conditioning, our own nervous system, and then we kind of put our stamp on it. We filter it through our personality and through our patterns of thinking, and we put it out in a certain way. That's why we have our opinions, we have our thought processes, which are slightly different because each person has what I would call a vibratory signature. Is that everyone has their signature through their vibrational manifestation, and so we color or we filter consciousness. Now, in the past, I would say that humanity was similar to a small 15-inch black and white television. When you received the program, the picture was black and white, it was hazy, you kept having to retune it to try to keep the picture. As technology increased of the television, we went to a color television, and then to a 25-inch color television, and then to plasma, then to high definition. Now we have whatever, now we have 100-inch televisions and whatever technology. What that analogy means that human beings increase their technology also. And that's the technology of perception and interior expansion and evolution of the human being, of the human incarnation. And so through that development of the human being, through training or spiritual programs or meditation, and also through the human nervous system, which also naturally evolves according to its energetic environment and everything it's receiving from the sun and the cosmic energies. As that evolves, we are opening up the reception. So we're not getting a black and white picture of anymore. We're getting a color picture. And so we understand more. We are widening our filters, and consciousness is coming through more and more and manifesting through us. So the more we can take away our filters and our conditioning, the more we can be a kind of repository and a participant in manifestation of consciousness. And that's why it's so important now, I would say, is that because certain elements in the world externally are trying to constrain reality and give a certain picture, evolution is always about expanding the understanding of the cosmos, understanding our place in the wider reality. And we are bringing it through, Matt. Humans are bringing this through. And by understanding that, we're not channeling it, we are merging with it. And so, whereas I think the older model is, we use the term channeling, like people would channel other intelligences, people would channel just a greater field of consciousness. But I would say, and as what came through the book, most recent book, is that, we were told to say it's not channeling, it's allowing. Every human can allow the greater consciousness to come through them because it's a mutual merging. And that's where the unified field comes to me, an understanding is that we are part of it and we can merge it in through our vibratory signature, through our physical manifestation into life today. Well, that was a mouthful.
well, I loved all that. And it reminded me of the time I was doing this meditation, and anyone can do this. I like it. It's like, okay, you go into meditation and then you think about, your body, and then you think about where do these thoughts come from? You observe the thoughts, and then you think, well, what is producing those thoughts? And then you try to go back a layer, and then if you can find anything, what's producing that, you find is what's producing that. And so when you talk about our filter of consciousness emerging with, let's say, the unified field or information or our perceptions or whatever's coming through us, my thought is, what are those origins? We think about cosmos, or the Bible will talk about the breath of life. Where does this, in your research, what do you think the origin of creation is? Where's this original power source that's activating us, that's giving us the breath of life, that's creating this whole thing? Have you thought about, like, what's your perception on that one? And that's where I think of, like, that source, like the infinite, is it, because I don't think it's a person, I don't know what it is. Like, it's just so far beyond the scope of my consciousness that I'd like to think about it, but also integrate with it, because to me it must be benevolent. It must be something that is beautiful and good because it gave me life and it's created all of this, and I'm a part of that, and I get to have some sort of free will in this experience. Right. And I get that choice. And I do think we're in a free will universe. So I'd be curious about your ideas on that.
Definitely, I would agree with you that the origin of the source is not only benevolent, it's more than that. It's ultimate life affirming. You could call it the ultimate love. Just that it's difficult for us to use that word because usually people have baggage around it. But just consider ultimate unconditional love is life affirming. But how that manifests in certain realms, especially as you say, in certain realms where free will is given, then that's different. Now, I'm not. I can't give an ultimate answer because even in my experience and my meditations, I can't say the source is this because it's coming through gradually. If I had complete contact with source, I'd probably blow up. I think our nervous system would have an overload because we are in a material body, and you can't put too much energy in a body which can't handle it. So I think this kind of we have an understanding through certain gradations, a gradual kind of way. And it's definitely, I mean, a lot of the wisdom traditions have talked about, the one source. Even Plotinus and Neoplatonism called it the one. Um, Even Kabbalah talked about this ultimate one stillness that then expanded into replications of itself. And a lot of traditions talk about that we are all life, or all uh, realms or realities of life are kind of waves coming off the origin. Um, Now, in my research, I also talk about the work of another researcher called Chris Bache, um, who did his own research. He used a certain kind of he did a kind of experimental research with. He was an academic scientist, so he used over 20 years. He went through a kind of narcotic experimentation, and he went through 20 years. He managed to go and reach certain levels of the cosmic mind, which he would call. But all of that was a very slow learning process because he wasn't ready to get to the next stage, because his body would be, blown by it. So I think that, through meditation, we can get to certain states which are reflections of the ultimate origin. Um, but even like the states like nirvana, which they talk about, wouldn't, to a certain state, it's not totally with the origin, because the origin is I think beyond conception, but we're getting there. And um, it's untalkable about, really. If we get to a certain state, we get a state we can't put into words. The whole body shivers in a way. Um, but we have to learn to get closer to that, and through our lived experience in materiality, to bring as much through us as possible. And the closer we get to that understanding, the more um, gracious I think we become, because gratitude is a part of that understanding. So when we see people who are manifesting more negative energies, then we know that they're just not getting this access to that source energy, um, because otherwise they won't behave like that. So I think we may not get through it in one lifetime either, but we are getting to a stage where we can represent more this energy which is beyond us, but which we are a part of.
Well, I love that answer. It reminds me of, living in an electromagnetic universe. And so if we're all, I don't even know if this is the right word to say, conductors, like an outlet, right? We have a certain voltage that the body can handle. So if you're given too
Mhm.
much, you're just going to explode. It's going to explode the mind. It's going to explode the body. It can't handle that voltage. And so as we do our work, as we progress, we're going to be able to hold a higher voltage, hold a vibration, hold a new understanding. And I feel like a lot of people want to rush this process. And it's an interesting
Mhm.
thing because when you have a child, they're perfect as they are. And, 1, 2, 3, up to 5 and 8. And, teenage years are always perfect. But somewhere as an adult, we feel like we're supposed to know everything, right? Whether it's when we're
Mhm.
graduated university in our 20s and 30s, but when you get to your 70s, 80s, and 90s, you've gotten to this point where you realize you're never going to know everything. It's a continual expansion. You've kind of surrendered that idea. You surrender to this greater understanding, this greater energy, and you can do so willingly, or you could just hold on and pretend you know everything forever. It's definitely a choice.
Mhm.
But I feel like there is comfort in kind of surrendering that. I'm not going to know everything. I'm in continuous expansion. I'm in continuous mystery and awe of this life. And I like how you talked about, this being a benevolent force, because it feels like then it would be guiding us through our experiences, to allow us to take on more energy, more information, or more knowledge, in which then we can go and apply. Because
Mhm.
when you ride a bicycle as a kid, you don't start with a massive bike and start going downhill and do all kinds of crazy things. You wait a little bit. You don't put a 12-year-old in a car, but 16 and 18, you can give them a car, but you don't give them a Ferrari right away,
Mhm.
because they will crash that. I would
Mhm.
have crashed it immediately, and I would have loved one. So it takes time to develop these skills and to be okay with the process. To be
Mhm.
okay with wherever you are in the process. And I also think it requires a willingness, right? That goes back to that will and desire to merge with this greater truth, to merge with a greater understanding, to be a conduit for what life wants to bring through you and however you perceive that creator, source, God, the universe, whatever that is. And I think that that has to be given up freely, you know? And
Mhm.
so that's where I feel like you can actually, be led by and merge with the universe. And, in lesser words, I'd be curious your thoughts on wholeness because I feel like that so many people out there struggle with um, just trauma and not feeling good enough and judgment, you know what I mean, and feeling shame and guilt and all these
Mhm.
things that really keep us down. How do you see the concept of wholeness and how we can move into a higher vibrational state where we're in the sense of, I love myself completely. I am whole as I am because I feel like every human is incomplete. So that's part of the acceptance for me when I'm talking to people about it. It's like you're a child in the eyes of the universe. You can't know everything. That's a part of it.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, trauma is a big issue, especially in today's world, modern world, day and age, and a lot of it again goes back to, I think, externalizations, because we are giving so many expectations, and the world is always wanting us to to compete. I mean, these were the old energies. I call them the C energies: competition, conflict, conquering, and control. Whereas the C energies, which are the wholesome energies, are the C energies of connection, communication, compassion, collaboration, consciousness. And and if you want to give it a visual style, then the kind of external negative energies, they're kind of like a vertical hierarchy: control, conquest, you know con- and this kind of containment is vertical, which a lot of our societies were ruled by those vertical hierarchies. And now we're seeing the world changing, especially through our the way we're connecting across the world. And I see it more lateral, horizontal. And that's where you get different energies manifesting of communication, collaboration, compassion, consciousness. So I think everything's changing to try to bring in those energies of wholeness. But if we're still being pulled back by the other energies, which say, you have to go and achieve this in life. You have to, if you don't do this within your lifetime, you haven't been a success. You know, these are all traumatizing concepts, and they're all externally based, because we are being conditioned to authority, to external authority, and that's our measurement often. We measure ourselves by what our peers are doing, what our colleagues at school, what have they achieved. They're now earning X amount, and I'm, and I'm not doing that. So am I a failure? So really, if you have those external comparisons, they're always going to take you off track, because everyone's path is different. And you know and the grass is always greener. You may think that your friend is earning lots of money, they're earning whatever 200,000 a year, they've got a good job, they've got a good car, but they may come to a complete breakdown. Now, one example is after the 2008 economic crash, when a lot of bankers were lost their jobs, some banks, folded and went bankrupt. There were lots of instances of these financial with kids committing suicide. You know, you took their job away from them, you took their money away from them, and they felt that they lost their purpose, they lost their place in life, and they were committing suicide. you know and then you realize that if that's your measurement of life, then how twisted is that? So if we've been trained and conditioned to put everything external to us, where in fact life is the contrary, we have everything within us, and it's going to manifest in so many different ways. There are whatever 7.5 billion people on the planet, therefore life is going to manifest in 7 billion different ways, and you can't compare with someone else, and you're not being judged, and you don't have to compete, and you can be happy just having a simple life, tending a garden and having just enough resources to live on. You can be happy being in a monastery, if that gives you your fulfillment. But you know I think you have to find out what works for you internally and not measure it externally. But then, that's the first step, I would say, Matt.
I love all that, and I love what you said. Your last sentence: that you have to figure out what works for you internally and not measure it externally. And when I've worked with a lot of people who are good at things like writing or art, or they have something they're passionate about, usually they're pretty good at it. And
Mm-hmm.
often their resistance will rise to putting it out because they're worried about what the external result will be. And I've always just suggested to them, if you could do what you love, art, music, writing, anything, a podcast, and everybody you love, writes you a handwritten letter about why you suck, and you still know you should do it because you love it, then do it, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
about what you receive back. It's about, does it line up with who you are? And I think that that's so important because if you measure it with an external validation, you're gonna diminish what you do. You're not going to be going to your full capabilities because that fear is going to hold you back rather than just creating, from the space of the most authentic part of who you are. And that's what's most important. And so I want to ask, how do you I'm always curious with people, if we live in a benevolent universe, one thing I've always struggled with was the harm that I see, right? So I go through the law summit, and a lot of the people who teach it, they're saying, I'm not worried about them coming in and taking your free will away. But then I looked at things at like the Bolshevik Revolution, and I was in Cambodia, the killing fields, and trying to feel like, why did people do this to each other, and how was this allowed, like, here? It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
make any sense. And so, in your model of the world and what you've gone through, how do you either make peace with or understand these evils on the world? Because when we look at, kind of what's going on now, if I look at it, I'm like, well, is this the Great Awakening? And everybody's now
Mm-hmm.
having this opportunity to reflect on their reality and their choices and come back closer to Source, God, the Creator. And, we know the difference between right and wrong. So we have to choose that individually. But at the same time, what they want to architect and what's been architected in other countries and carried out has been pretty horrendous. And so I'd be
Mm-hmm.
curious your views on how you see that.
Sure, and we do live in a cruel environment as well. We know the human cruelty that's been going on and still goes on, but of course, that doesn't negate the fact that there is a benevolent source of energy behind that. But we are in a particular, very small, in cosmic terms, manifestation reality, and in that reality, you can get disturbances and dissonance. And I mean, I try to tackle the same question myself, and I produced a book called "Healing the Wounded Mind: Global Psychosis and the Search for the Self," trying to understand the same issue. And what I came to kind of understand is that, um, because we're operating much through an intellectual level as well, and through the human mind, the mind can pick up viruses, just like the body can pick up a biological virus, and the computer can pick up electronic virus. The mind can pick up viruses, and in fact, there is this term called wetiko, which you may be familiar with. Um, the the Native Americans in North America had this term called wetiko, and there's a great book by Jack Forbes called "Christians and Cannibals," I think it is, and he was a Native American. He talked about this term wetiko, where when the first Europeans came over to America, um, you know, some of the Native Americans thought that they were crazy, that they'd been taken over by a something in their heads, because they had this whole different idea of how to live together, and what to do with the land, and we know what how that turned out initially. And so the concept of Wetiko, and even the shamans talk about this as well, and Don Juan and Carlos Castaneda talks about this. He calls it the foreign installation. The idea that we've got something foreign, not natural in our minds, just like a meme. Okay. Now, sometimes if you hear this really bad pop song, you don't like it, but it's in your head and you start singing it. Jingle, a bit horrible jingle. I won't name any bad pop songs because there's thousands of them. But it's the same as a propaganda advert. It gets in your head. Well, so does a negativity or a negative thought, and we propagate that if we're not conscious of it. And ideology can work on that. The ideology that was behind the killing fields, or the Cultural Revolution in China, behind many revolutions. It's an ideology which can be a thought form, but a kind of virus type of thought form, which unknowingly we pass it on if we're not conscious of how we can filter consciousness. And we get drawn into it. Modern examples is mob mentality. When you get certain people together and there's this energy of resonance of this negative kind of thought process, you get drawn into a mob. And it's so difficult to pull yourself out of that because it energetically pulls you in. So if we take that back to the idea of vibrations, which we started our conversation on, all reality is a kind of resonance or vibration. And therefore we have the notion of entrainment. Not entertainment, but entrainment is when obviously certain sounds or vibrations get aligned with each other. So if you're with friends and you're on the same level, you can kind of tune in, be in sync. We have these terms, I'm really in sync with this person. This person gives me a good vibe, we're on the same wavelength. We have the vocabulary to explain it. What we're doing is aligning with a resonance. And often, if we choose certain aspects of our lives, like meditation, to read certain books, to listen to certain uplifting music, we can attune with a certain resonance. But the world at the moment seems to be attuning with a lower, denser resonance vibration. And that's so easy to get sucked into. And I think that is not necessarily a manifestation of satanic evil, but there are negative thought forms which then come into society, and they kind of manifest power and greed and control, and those are so tempting through our conditioning to get dragged into that, whereas their service to self, whereas service to others through grace, generosity, sincerity, compassion, they're a finer vibration which often gets kind of overtaken and hijacked by the stronger vibrations of control and selfishness and power. And that's what seems to manifest more. And that's what we're seeing through the external manifestation in life today to a great degree, Matt.
Yeah, when you give that example, it makes me think of the idea that danger is real, but fear is optional. And I know this
Mhm.
through extreme sports and training pro athletes, where when we'd be preparing for a new trick or doing something, if you mess up, especially, if you look at street skateboarding and street snowboarding, things like that, every single time that you progress, you're putting yourself at risk. Even if you're doing something that you're pretty confident in doing, if it goes wrong, your legs could break, horrible things could happen, especially when you get really good and you're flying off jumps that are 80 or 100 feet, and you're flipping and spinning through the air, and I've seen it, and I've seen people get carted off and really badly injured at very high level snowboarding, dropping out of the air like 100 feet almost from overshooting a jump, and that's horrifying. So the danger is there, and we look at a reality on a more of a world scale now of these possibilities that we see. And
Mhm.
my thought has always been that, okay, look at them for what they are, because if you ignore it, it could cause you harm. Now, you don't want to stay there and dwell on it and be afraid all day, because that's not helpful either. But pretending it doesn't exist, I don't think that that's helpful. Maybe there's a higher. This is where I
Mhm.
am in kind of calculating these things that are going on. So once we can become aware of it, then we can just focus fully on the solutions. And if we are in a time where there is increased density, increased fear, and increased dangers, and increased actual harms that are happening, it also increases the possibility for the universe to work through us to be a part of the solution. There's
Mhm.
always going to be the more greater the harms, the more greater the disparity, the more great the opportunity to be a part of that a solution. And that's where, again, you can go back to prayer or intent or your own work and say, okay, look, I understand that this is going on, but I want to be in alignment. I want to be of service. I want to help.
Yeah.
I want to be part of the greater good. And that's where you'll be led. And that might, in order to get there, you might have to cross a bridge and let go of something that was holding you back, that was no longer serving you, that you're unable to hold on to get to that next step.
Mhm.
And the more willing we are to engage in this process of our own evolution as the world evolves with or without us, because it might just explode it for you if you don't want to kind of let go of the rope to the new thing. I feel like it might be a little bit of an easier process. Not that the process is easy, but to have a little bit of a easier time, rather than I kind of equate it to being skiing on the back of a boat, and if you let go and you fall and you keep holding onto the rope, you get dragged on the water. It's very
Mhm.
uncomfortable and you kind of get drowned. And you see people do that and it's not very good. So just letting go, and then having
Mhm.
faith that a different boat or something else is going to come around and pick you up and support you. Um, what do you
Mhm.
think of that rant?
I Great. I agree with everything you said, and I think you said it so well. And I like how you bring the body into this as well, because you know, I know from your background, you've worked more through martial arts and the body, and you know that if you overthink something, you break it just at the last moment. If you get to a point and then the mind kicks in and says, "We've got to do it this way," and then you lose the rhythm because um, really the way that we're greatly influenced and these let's say these negative influences come in is through the mind, because we've moved into an intellectualized material reality. And if you look at material reality now, with all our goods and all our devices and everything we're connecting to, is trying to focus on the mind and the intellect. And that's a sign actually of the intellect is good. It can take you so far. We create inventions and great, devices. There's an old Eastern saying which says you would ride your donkey to the front door of your house, but you wouldn't ride it into your house. There's a time when you get off the donkey. In other words, one vehicle gets you so far. And I think humanity has been using the intellectual consciousness or intellectual element of itself to a certain extent through the Industrial Revolution. Now we've got to a stage where it's going to start to be dangerous for us, or it's going to pull us in a direction that's not beneficial if we don't start to pull back. And you know the as biology says, is that the mind, really, the whole body is a mind. you know the heart gives off more electromagnetic pulses than the mind does. It's receiving the input externally in the same way as the mind. The mind's just a chip, just a processor, just just a chip that does all the final kind of processing before it puts it out. But the whole body is receiver. And I think the bottom line is, like, we have to allow the vital energies and the life, or the life essence, the life source, however you want to frame it, has to come through us, has to come through us bodily, wholly, not just, squeezed into an intellectual kind of programming synopsis. So the body knows, we talk about gut reaction. I got a gut reaction about this. I trust my instinct. So I think, or I feel that the way we should need to go is just allow things more to come through us and try to trust our body instinct, our innate knowledge. Not the acquired knowledge which you get put onto you from outside, but the innate knowledge, which is all running through the human body. Um, you asked a question earlier about where do we think this comes from? Like, is it from source? Well, we've always given it names. Like the Greeks used to say, we get creativity and inspiration from the muses. Used to talk about the muses. And any kind of creative person, whether you're a musician, um, an artist, or a sports person, you get your inspiration and it comes through you. And we don't have to, you know, put it into the ego and say, I'm creating this, it's coming through me. No, we're part of the merge. We're allowing life to come through us. And when you do that, I would agree with you, the resonance shifts, and life starts to seem different for you. Different aspects of life get pulled into your zone, into your remit, because that's where you're at. That's where you're putting yourself out there, whole body allowance of life to come forth. And so I think we have to pull away from intellectualization somewhat as well.
Well, I love that answer. And as you're saying it, I was thinking to myself, the divine or the creator or spirit is beyond fear and it's beyond mind. who we truly are, the energy that pervades everything. So if I look at the climate today and I see some of the potential fears and things that are happening, that's in the level of the mind. That's in the level of
Hmm.
consciousness, specifically the dense level of fear. I'm not thinking about, well, what if this does work out? What if this, because there are other possibilities too. And I've never had, and no one ever has, control of the bigger picture. That's where surrender comes into. We will exit this planet through death. That's what we know. We
Hmm.
know that our time here is limited. So this greater picture, if when we're going to be called home or back to source, or however you see that, is going to happen. That's 100% guarantee. And so I feel like everything else, to a degree, is beyond our control. And whatever this simulation or experience is, it's this merger of who we are as a soul and spirit through our choices and how we navigate what we're observing in our reality. And so when I think about fear and the mind and the level of intellect, I know that this divine source, the entire ocean, so to speak, is beyond that level. It's much deeper and it's much greater. So if you are in the level of fear, if you are able to go to a level deeper, and you talked about innate intelligence, I think that's a great example because I give the example of, if you were in a cafeteria or something and a bunch of lions were released and they're eating everybody, like, oh my goodness, wherever you are, all of a sudden you would like jump off the garbage can, get onto the rafter, like do a monkey thing. And your mind wouldn't think about any of these things. Your
Hmm.
body would go ahead and do that. And in another sense, when we're observing this world in reality and we're having these conflicts and we're having these experiences, we know in our innate intelligence and who we are the difference between right and wrong. And
Hmm.
when I look at what's happening in the world, it almost seems like I could break it down to the option of each individual to choose right from wrong, to choose spirit, God, creator, source, cooperation, benevolence, compassion, or kind of start with the fear thing and then start to compromise who we are. Oh, I'm going to do this because of this and this and this and this. But innately that it's wrong, that it's
Hmm.
incorrect. And you're doing it a lot of times through materialism. So even if it's taking that job because you got to feed your family, I totally get that. And I'm not in that exact experience. But that would be a great leap of faith to say, okay, will the creator support me if I don't support this thing that goes against my innate intelligence? And that's
Hmm.
a big leap of faith, right? And I feel like a lot of people might have to do that, but we always know innately the difference, I believe, unless we've gotten so far off the track, where, and get into weird occult stuff, you sell your soul to the devil, or you keep compromising your soul till now you're soulless and you've lost compassion, you've lost empathy, you're not even concerned with those things. And so to me, what's your view on what's going on now? Do you see this as the great awakening? Do you see this as like, oh goodness, we're all gonna die, or how do you see this playing out? I hear a couple different things out there. I do know that they have written out in their plans what they would like humanity to go towards, and my thought is it won't work, because it's very grand. There's many reasons why I don't think it will work, but nonetheless, it's their plan because they wrote it down and you can go read it, and
Hmm.
and it's not good.
Yeah.
So, how do you view these times, and how do you suggest we can navigate them with peace and purpose and power?
Hmm. Well, I mean, it's a very pertinent question, and I think we should start to answer that by the question of fear, because the fear, I think, is fundamental to what's happening right now. Because what's being played out is the fear of mortality, the fear of death. So even if there's a 0.01% chance of us dying, people panic, and they have to secure their mortality. But you see, that plays into the material paradigm, is that once this life is over, that's it, kaput, you know? And people fear, I don't want to leave, I'm not ready to leave, I don't want to die and that's it. But when you realize that um, you are having you know, an experience in a physical body, and that the spirit that is coming through the spiritual body is eternal. There is no death. There is transitions to different states. There's a transition out of the body, but life is eternal. And so you're only talking about a certain stage, but that's not talked about. And even simple subjects such as near-death experiences and life after death, the consensus narrative poo-poos it. It's like, oh, that's all woo-woo stuff. That's all fuzzy voodoo stuff. You know, you're a bit crazy, you've been smoking wacky backy, that kind of stuff. They Society ridicules you because they don't want this understanding to become part of the general understanding. Because once that comes in, then we start to lose a fear of death, because we know that we're just having a temporary experience, and we are so much more than our bodies. We are so much more than the narrative has told us we are. And so the human is so much more than we can even conceive of. And that's why now I see the mainstream narrative going towards a program of dehumanization. It's trying to belittle the human being. So not only is it a control through fear of death, it's a control through biology, what I call biopower. And I've talked about this in some of my earlier work, Hijacking Reality, biopower and biosecurity. They want to get into our bodies, and then that goes down a line of transhumanism and technocracy. And these are subjects, large enough for a whole discussion in itself. So I don't really want to expand on technocracy. I'm sure a lot of listeners will understand what technocracy means. There's this movement to get humanity contained into a social management system of biotechno-economic control. So therefore, we're kind of, the human being and our abilities are contained. And the more that then we tend to kind of hybridize the human being, we kind of move away from the transcendent power of the human being, the power of source to manifest through us. And I call this the theory of weak bodies. We've been conditioned to feel that the body is weak, or my immune system won't support me. The immune system is a wonderful, wonderful system that's been developed over millennia. We have to have faith in the human body to adapt. But of course, there's means to supplement that. But do not move into a narrative of I'm so weak that the human body is helpless, because the weak body narrative plays into the transhumanist narrative. But when you're a living experience connected to source, there's so much natural power. Now, power isn't negative, it's how it's used. But natural power of goodness to come through, to manifest and to go towards evolution, positive evolution, creative evolution. That is, again, an innate human power. But I think that what's happening in the world now is that control structures are trying to bring a containment of the human being, and therefore are devising many structures to increase that containment, psychologically, biologically, technologically, economically, and all those means. Yeah, I think ultimately it's going to fail, because they're not, the powers that be, let's call them that for want of a better word, don't fully understand or can be connected to the great source of consciousness that's coming through us, because they've blocked it. They've lost their empathy. They've lost their natural connection, and so they're blind. They've blinded themselves, and that's their weakness. When you're blind to the power of the human beingness, then you think you can overrule it, but ultimately you can't. You can contain it to a certain degree, but ultimately you can't overrule it. And that's the human positive future that will come about, I feel. But maybe a kind of a rough ride for a short time, but I always put my cards in the human future over the non-human future.
I love that. And I like how you framed it at the end there, like disconnecting from source, right? And I've seen it as parasitical, right? They're trying to contain this thing because it's incredibly powerful, but, we're connected to life and adaptation, right? We're connected to the source, the greater intelligence, and they're using level of mind and fear and body and limitation to limit the infinite, which is impossible. And so all that we're really required to do, maybe, this is my theory because I don't freaking know much, but it's like move into that power, to align to that power. And that's why it is faith, it is spiritual, and it's learning to set your consciousness and your gaze and your reality to those things. Observe nature, observe the birds, observe what's around you, connect with yourself, and silence the outdoors. And I realized, like, they don't create anything. And as the TV was on the other day, and I'm looking, I was like, this whole power structure is like the artificial intelligence. It's on the digital. It's like the digital world. The television wants to come out into the physical. All
Yeah.
we need to
Mhm.
do is you shut off the TVs and coronavirus goes away immediately and all the other nonsense, right? We
Yeah.
start connecting with our neighbors. It's just done, you know? And so it is a really powerless system, but it's powerful when we let it infect our consciousness. And so it's
Mhm.
up to the individual soul to reclaim it and to begin to use your will and your consciousness and your spirit to realign with that greater intelligence. And, you know, like we said before, there's infinite paths to the way home towards coherence, towards energy. You don't need a guru, you don't need anything. I think that you just need that willingness, right? That the
Mhm.
being, you know, show me the way in whatever way that you've taught or that you've resonated with or whatever. You're going to be led to a greater and greater truth. And as you expand your electromagnetic field in the body, you'll be given more information. And
Mhm.
you know, there's probably other weird things going on that they, you know, positive beings or uh, other mysteries of the universe could accelerate your process when you're open to that. And that's that alignment thing. But fear is their greatest tool. And at that
Mhm.
low energy of fear, you're not going to be open to a greater understanding. And so, you know, as things happen, be aware of them, right? But don't put all your time there. Focus on how can I be a part of the solution? Focus on your adaptation and focus on how you can do anything you can to raise your vibration by connecting with nature or by that I mean how you feel, right? By
Mhm.
going for a walk, by doing anything that lights you up, because the more dense you are in the level of fear, the less that can come through. And I feel like that's an important part of the process.
Mhm. Yeah, it is. And you made a good point as well, talking about um, you know, their system can't create anything. They're trying to persuade us to create our own prison, you know, but it has to come through us because they can set up the idea, they can set up the plan, but they it can only be manifested through us because the only humanity which is in contact with source is genuinely creative. And the control structures can't create. They can devise, they can scheme, you know, um, but they can't ultimately create, which makes them that's their weak spot as well, because they've lost their contact. They've lost that, they're like psychopathic. They can't constructively create. And so really the power that they have is through illusion. And that's what they're working on, the power of illusion to get us to believe the illusion. And then we start doing things for them, believing it's for our better good. So, but ultimately, if everyone just kind of had this epiphany and woke up from the illusion and said, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not paying my taxes. I'm not going into the system, you know, they'll be screwed. So they need our willing compliance. And that's why it's so deviant, because they're trying all these schemes through propaganda, through media, entertainment, to 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 twist our willing compliance because they need it. And so the more we're aware of this, we can just disconnect our willing compliance and say, well, I want to do it my way through my way forward. And you can see this, that when you connect with people who are on the same understanding, you're laughing together, you're doing something, you're being creative. And when you see people who are totally into the illusion, they're depressed, they're scared, you know, they feel weak, they feel there's no future, they're not laughing. Um, so you see, I think there's total dissonance. And that's important, to get out of that illusion into creativity and into manifestation and into joy, and into hope and faith and trust. Um, so yes, it may be a rough ride for a while, but through the roughness can be a greater awakening, because sometimes you need more friction to kind of get that spark. You don't always create a flame without friction. And so for those people, again, no judgment whatsoever. Every person comes to their awareness in their own time. Everyone has their own internal alarm clock. Not everyone has the alarm clock set for 6:30 in the morning. Allow people the time to wake up when their bell goes off. But maybe the friction will speed up that alarm clock. And so let it be, but don't get dragged into the friction.
Yeah, I love that. And it's, to me, when I really reflected on this, although I don't like it, I see it as necessary because the
Mhm.
system in which we lived when I broke it down, is not something that is an alignment with creation and good. When you take down, really look at these systems and understand them, you realize that the intent behind them is not a positive one. And often, our individual lives, we might not be living as cooperative or as coherent or to our full potential anyway, right? We're kind of caught in this illusionary system where we're almost spinning the wheels rather than contributing to our own spiritual evolution and to that of our community in a meaningful way, based on values, based on truth, based on reality, not then just chasing this illusionary money for a thing so we can get material objects to buy more pleasures, to do all these different things. And so the way that our society is constructed, it almost needed to get demolished. And from that demolition and friction, we can look to rebuild it from a brand new framework that is based on values that work for everyone. And it's a massive opportunity. So it's very uncomfortable. It's like if you, get a piece of land and there's a house on it, and that house is falling apart. You kind of got to tear it down. And in the
Mhm.
meantime, it's going to be a little bit stressful, but then you get to build something else new and you get to reimagine it. And the beautiful thing is, we get to reimagine this as the best of humanity, as the
Mhm.
best the world has to offer, for the peak of where we are as a civilization. We look and we say, you know what? And, the, what do you call it? I don't know. The enemy, let's say, on the planet, they don't have that much power. So the second that
Mhm.
we just stop participating, you said another thing where they need your compliance. When I studied the law and did the law summit, which I invite people to check out, they need your consent. Right. And there's
Mhm.
all these tricky ways they get you to consent. But the
Mhm.
more, it's like, no, it's all consent based. And when you start to reorient your worldview to understanding and knowing that fully, like my dad can't understand that, right? I've tried to explain him in so many different ways, but he is under the conditioning that, oh, well, they'll get you. The boogeyman will
Mhm.
get you. You know what I mean? You got to do, and from all these experts, like, no, 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 they need your consent for sure. And it takes a bit of understanding. So it's exciting, I think, that once we just address that and understand what this influence is that doesn't have our
Mhm.
best interest at heart, we get to reimagine a world based on the best of who and what we are. And when we synergize and sync up with that, it's not going to take generations to build. We're going to be able to do it quickly. We're going to be able to
Mhm.
do
Mhm.
really incredible things fast and correct the trajectory we are on, because we're going to kind of be letting go of these anchors that were steering us in a way that wasn't conducive or beneficial for any of our evolution.
Mhm. That's right. And I mean, the last word you said, evolution, is spot on because, we're part of an evolutionary process, and evolution is an open system. It's always expanding further and further. And, part of my, I mean, and now that I look back at my background when I did complex systems, I realize that that's a great analogy to think of that, because complex systems, there's so much energy building into a system, it gets to a point where it needs to either break through or break down. At that point, it needs more energy in order to break through and then expand the complex system. If it doesn't get that, then it breaks down. Now, kind of positive evolution is always that breakthrough, moving on, expanding, and then learning more, expanding your perceptions. It's an evolving system. Whereas what's happening, I think, in the world today, and the other powers, the powers that be are devolving powers. Their only energy they understand is the energy of entropy, because they've cut themselves off from source and they're detached. They're not fed by the kind of evolving energy. So they see it as entropic. And therefore, they probably feel that everything's going to break down. They see the systems breaking down. They know that they have to contain their systems. They're panicking. So this containment, they're trying to just maintain a closed system. And that's why we have all this paradigm that, death is the end. There's no more than this life. It's a closed system. Closed system is fear. They contain the system. They're happy. They're in control. But the greater reality, the greater picture is that we're going through a breakthrough moment. Don't be fooled into believing their containment strategy. No, we're using this energy of disruption to feed the breakthrough, because all breakthrough needs more chaotic energy to move it forward. So That's where we're moving to, but we've been fooled into believing it's a breakdown containment strategy, but it's not. And so when we can perceive the bigger picture and realize what we're a part of, it's like a breath of fresh air. You have hope. You breathe deeply. It's like, whoa, I'm not screwed. I'm not going to believe them. There is an evolving system I'm a part of. It's a part of cosmos. I'm a part of greater intelligence. I'm a part of source. I'm not going to die. My body will die, but I'm not going to die. I'm not going to go into fear. Let's go for it. There's so much more in front of me. Life opens up.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And even from like we are going to die, but I do believe we're infinite. So that's one thing that people need to grasp. The other thing is, when I would teach snowboarding, for example, if you're going to do a backflip, if you visualize it and intend and create powerful belief systems on being able to land it and evolve, you're going to increase your probability. You're not going to land it 100%, but the
Mhm.
probability is greatly increased. So with this idea of looking at all these things that could break down, just that fundamental worldview and belief that I am protected by the creator in creation. I am in alignment with life force. I will be taken care of and find a solution. To
Mhm.
live that and to be able to step in that is incredibly powerful. Maybe you don't succeed, right? And this is me like teaching the backflip, but every time I've taught
Mhm.
one, they either land or they come close. They are
Mhm.
not hurt. They're not they don't die, right? And
Mhm.
so it's stepping into that energy. And then the more you're able to do that, and that's why I have faith in this, because I've seen it work in my own life by taking these gigantic leaps of faith that anybody who's logical minded or even tends towards my a little bit of a risky behavior would never do, because it didn't make sense financially. There was no certainty whatsoever. But as I learned through my life, there's always going to be something. I'm always going to be
Mhm.
led. I'm not going to be stranded. I'm always going to be supported. And there might be times of challenge, and it might not be true every single time. But on the other side of that challenge is still support. You know what I mean? And it's a much more empowering belief system rather than to say, oh, I'm screwed and I got to hold on to the system with all my life and get dragged down by it, rather than saying, where's the opportunity for my adaptation towards something better, more cooperative and upgraded. And when we have
Mhm.
that view, we're going to be led to those solutions. But if we close it down, we're going to kind of get dragged and demolished with this system, and it will be a much more uncomfortable experience.
Yeah, we will make it more comfortable for us, and then we blame other people. We blame the system, because ultimately we don't know what we need to learn. If we knew what we need to learn, then we could map it all out. But we don't ultimately know. So we may have an experience which you find that we feel is negative, or that that wasn't so good. I failed, or it hurt me, or I broke a bone, or something. But that could be an experience that you needed to learn to get to where you need to go. So we can't close ourselves off too early, because if we do, we just end up chasing our tails. So we have to be open, we have to allow, and by allowing each moment, each experience, reflecting on the experience. Okay, I learned from that. I made a fool of myself on that one, won't do it again. But, we move forward. Every time we learn, the source is learning through us, you know, the source is learning about all aspects of life. Because, the great phrase says that, I was a hidden treasure and I wanted to be known. The source, the energy wants to come through us. It wants to experience through us. And in the process, aspects of itself, i.e. us, can learn as well. We don't know what we're here to learn. So don't close it off at the first misfortune. And, and by that, we move on. And life is an incredible learning journey. And, we have to allow it to give us what we're here to receive.
I love it. I totally agree. This has been a wonderful
Mhm.
conversation. I've enjoyed the entire thing. Is there anything that you wish that I had asked or that you want to cover before we close this out?
No, I enjoyed the conversation thoroughly. You know, there's things you could have asked or not, but I know everything's organic, everything's natural. If you were meant to ask it, you would have done. I think we've had a great conversation. There was nothing artificial about it. Love speaking with you. Happy just to let it be as it is.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I enjoyed this as well. You've written a lot of books. Your newest one is now out. Where can the audience, if they want to dive a little bit more into your work, where's the best way they can do that?
Well, first off, they can probably search my name, kingsleyddennis.com. I have a website, Kingsley Dennis, there's not many other people has that, has that name. So you probably find me if you search for me. I have a website, kingsleydennis.com. If you go on there, I have a menu saying writings, and there's a list of essays. I have about something like 80 essays that are on there, all for downloading, for reading, for free. Read them. If you're interested more, go and search my books online. You can find my books. There's about 15 or 20 books. But, do your homework. What appeals to you? If you want to drop me a line, ask me a question, please do. You can find all the contacts from the webpage. Happy to be in contact and happy for everyone to do their own path, go their own way. And I support and salute everyone's individual journey.
Awesome. Well, I invite everybody to check out your work and your books. I've enjoyed this podcast. So thanks so much for coming on, and we'll see everybody else in the next episode.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. My pleasure.
My pleasure.